Welcome to Latte with a Lawyer, a podcast dedicated to bringing you the stories of some of America's most successful lawyers, figuring out what makes them tick, how they creatively solve problems, and how others aspiring to be them can follow in their footsteps.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Latte with a Lawyer. I'm your host, Jonathan Brickman, and this morning we have with us from Utah. I think you're from Utah, right?
That's right.
Clayton Preece with the law firm of Smith Hartvigsen. Did I say that correctly?
You did, actually.
Nice, excellent. Well, good morning to you.
Good morning.
It's early there, I know. So you must be drinking coffee. Latte with a Lawyer. What's your coffee of choice?
So I'm actually going to depart a little bit. I'm more of an herbal tea guy.
Ah, okay. Any special kind or just whatever they have at the grocery store?
Yeah, you know what? Just kind of whatever they have. I like anything with citrus in it for the most part.
All right, good, excellent, good. And that wakes you up. I think it's just the ritual of drinking something hot in the morning.
Yep.
So anyway, thanks for taking time. What tell us about the kind of work that you do out there?
Yeah, so my firm does a lot of water law. And so in the West, we're a very dry place. Utah is one of the most arid states in the country. And so water is really a premium out here.
Okay.
And so we are one of the premier water law firms in this state. And there's kind of a really wide range of practice. And then we have other practices that relate to that. I'm kind of more on the litigation side of the water practice. And so it's a lot of our cases we get into what happened with water maybe even 100 years ago, trying to figure out who has the rights to it, what they can use it for. And then another large part of our practice that has developed from that is representing a lot of municipal clients. And so we work with a lot of government entities, both to secure their water rights, to provide water for their citizens, as well as providing, other municipal type services. So complying with Open Meetings Act, government record requests, and advising them in a lot of different other capacities, including land use. So it's an interesting, I think it's a very interesting practice, and it's something a little bit different than particularly I went to law school on the East Coast, and water in different parts of the country is treated very differently. And out here, it's like I say, it's such a precious commodity that your land would be worth nothing if you don't have the water to do something on it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. So yeah, and I saw you went to GW in Washington, which is water is abundant, right? There's too much water. I'm a civil engineer, and I thought one of the great projects that we should undertake, and I don't know why we haven't done it, is figure out how to move water from the East Coast to the West Coast, like we do with oil.
That's right. I mean, right? Like I say, in a very historic drought out here, and there are places on the East Coast where it's constantly flooding, and it's one of the great allocation problems.
It doesn't make any sense to me. So you're fighting over water, meaning it's a precious commodity. So you want people. It's a limited resource. So that's what you're litigating about, I would imagine, right?
That's correct.
And but I never thought. I mean, I know it's dry there, but I never thought of it like California. But you're saying has the same kind of conditions.
Yeah, it does. And I think Utah is actually the second most arid state in the country, right behind Nevada.
Oh,
and
okay.
So there's obviously, we get a lot of, the winters here can be great if we get enough snowpack. There's certainly a lot of skiing, or a great ski destination.
Sure.
But if we don't get enough snow, and it's been, for the last few years, there've been fairly light winters out here, and so it's had really big impacts on water, particularly with agriculture and irrigation. Utah's an agricultural state, and there are a lot of farmers that are trying to deal with the water shortages.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, Utah looks like you're ready to go skiing. Is known for its skiing. It's powder in the world, right?
That's right. I love to go skiing. We go ski with my family every year. But yeah, there's a lot more they can do now. I mean, they make a lot of snow up there in the mountains, but if we don't, get enough water, look at what's happening in the Colorado River drainage with, Lake Mead, Lake Powell, they're all part of that drainage, and they're having to have some real thought about what to do with these continual low levels of water and runoff.
Yeah, are there any, I mean, listen, I mean, if you look at Israel, for example, right, desert, but they've mastered irrigation there. Are you starting to do some of those things in Utah as well?
Yeah, there are a lot of different measures that are being implemented. State through the legislature have allocated a lot of funds to try to solve the irrigation problems. And some of it is as simple as just water metering when it comes to residential lawns and things like that, making sure water metered. And some of it's more innovative. They're trying different things in agriculture to try to spread the water a little farther and make sure there's not as much evaporation loss. So there's a lot of innovation going on in this field, trying to figure out how best to make more do with limited resource.
Yeah. Okay. So give me an example of a case that you would litigate, like what the issues would be.
So it can be, so a few years ago, and this was kind of an interesting case that we started working on, which had to do with water in the Colorado River. And there was an individual that was able to acquire so water can be acquired through what's called a water right. And it's just, it's out in the West, that's the right to divert a certain amount of water to a certain place for a certain amount of time. So, there was an individual that got some shares, but there were some challenges to that from neighboring property owners. And this is water that, it was old mining water that he had gotten the shares to. And so we did a lot of research to see what had happened in the late 1800s, to see what had happened with the water, how the mine had been using it. And unfortunately for this individual, there were some gaps in the title. And so, there were issues on trying to figure out, how to get past that. So that's kind of one way that it comes up. Another,
and were you defending? What was your position on that? You were defending, or you were the plaintiff?
So on that one, we were the plaintiff, trying to get his water rights adjudicated or recognized by the courts, basically get them validated, to say, hey, these are valid water rights. He's got the right to take this amount of water. And so, and you get, in terms of the challenges on that, right, you can have everything from just a neighboring property owner that's saying, hey, I actually am the one using this water, or have historically used this water, or the farm hasn't used it. Or you get government entities, so the Department of the Interior, your land management. They may also come in and say, we don't think the water's been used. We think it's been forfeited. We think we've got the right to the water. And so there are a lot of hands that show up to say, no, this is actually ours.
Is there money at stake, like typical plaintiff attorneys? Is there any money at stake where you're getting damages?
Yeah, so there's kind of twofold, depending on the type of case. Under Utah's law, if there's an interference case where you're saying, well, someone has come in and they've taken my water, or they've somehow interfered with my diversion works. They've come in and they've filled in one of my irrigation ditches, something like that. You're entitled to attorney's fees by statute if you prevail on that. And then obviously if there are damages to crops, there are other other very real tangible damages that arise, and including restoration damages, to get in there and restore what's been done to these waterways.
Okay. And do you work on, so when you live, do you work on contingency? How do you get paid from these clients?
So
I'm trying to understand if it's like a
yeah,
typical plaintiff, medical malpractice, personal injury kind of.
right, right. So it's usually different than that. Usually it's just on an hourly.
Okay.
There's not as there's not as much of a contingency practice in these fields. In the end, there's usually not like as compared to a medical malpractice, there's usually not as big of a payout. It's largely more trying to get either injunctive relief, to prevent someone from doing what they're doing to your water. And then, and the damages is a small part of that. Mostly it is more about the injunctive or the adjudicative relief, because the water rights themselves are very valuable. And so, for each acre of a farm, you may need anywhere between 3 and 6 acre feet of water, and that's enough water to cover that acre with a foot of water. And water rights per acre can be anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000. And so, if you've got a 40-acre farm and you've got the water to divert that, you may have millions of dollars tied up in water rights that you're trying to get validated.
Sure. Okay. And obviously it must be a very active, busy practice, right? If you're focused on that.
It is.
Yeah.
And like I say, there's a lot of different areas where it comes up with, from title side to interference, and so it is a very busy practice.
So it's sort of in some ways like real estate, right? With title and, rights and defining what's yours and not yours, right? In many ways, land.
It is. Yeah, it's very similar. And one thing that is, there are forfeiture statutes, because it's such a precious commodity that if you can't prove that you've been using it, then you lose it.
Oh, that's interesting. You lose your rights to it, even if it's you. I don't know how you define. Is it based on where it is on your land?
So it's based on a couple of things. It's based on the so it's usually kind of more based on the source, right? So you might have a spring, a well, a stream of some sort. So there's a source that's named, and then you get permission to use it in a specific place. Okay. And so you have a point of, they call it a point of diversion, where you're taking it out of the natural drainage, and then a place of use where you're actually putting that water to use. And so so for example, if you were to purchase a farm and then the water has been used and then you don't do anything with it, the policy is, because it's so valuable, we don't want people just to sit on water. And so after a period of time, you haven't used it, someone can come in and file a forfeiture action and say, you didn't use it, you've lost it, and somebody else can appropriate it.
Is it, do people trade it like other commodities where you have it and people need it? So there's a supply and demand. Yeah,
so there is some of that. There's water can be bought and sold with water rights. There are irrigation companies that will sell shares of water, which give you the right to divert water for a certain amount of time. And so it is bought and sold as a commodity. It is. So it definitely is bought and sold in the commodities. The water shares themselves, it's not like the share of a company where it's easy to assess, like this is the going rate. It fluctuates a lot based on more like real estate, what's going on in that particular valley area, drainage, and what the demand is.
Yeah, interesting. So give me an example of like a case that you worked on that was really memorable. An interesting case.
So let's see. So I was working on one case that was, so this was in central Utah, and it had to do with water that was really flat. And so what was happening was, in order to divert water, a dam was being put in what we would call a river, for what people on the East Coast would think of as a small stream. Right. So basically a dam was being put in, and then water was flooding back to the point where it could be pumped out into a field. And what was interesting about this case was, as I talked about kind of getting into the histories, and to prove, what was being used and when it was being used. There was a lot of historical research that was done. And so some of the things that we were using were old journal entries and documents from the late 1800s, where people were talking about, going out and ice skating on these flat marshes in the wintertime, and or going out in some of these areas and fishing with their pitchforks when the water was up at these levels, and using that to then show that this was being used. And so so there was some really kind of interesting historical facts and things that I learned about, some practices like that were, they were just kind of interesting from a historical perspective. And then we were in a small courthouse, and the judge really wanted the parties to work it out. So right before opening statements, the judge said, "I want you guys to go back into the jury room and see the parties go back in the jury room and see if you can figure this out." And so we went into this small room and spent, by the judge's order, spent the day trying to figure out a kind of outside the box solution to get it resolved. And we were able to get it worked. We were able to kind of a temporary settlement in place that then took a year's worth of engineering to figure out how to make some practical changes. And it ended up settling in, farmers were able to, one farmer was able to keep his water, the other was able to keep some flooding off their property, and everyone went away more or less happy.
Oh, good. Excellent. What other, besides water issues, what other kind of work do you do? You said, I think construction is on your background.
Yeah, so we represent construction land use clients. So we do a lot of rezoning, things like that, trying to get land rezoned, and then I do a lot of municipal work. So we work with cities, and it can be there are a lot of different kind of interesting challenges that come up in working with the city. This last year, I was working with a local city. We were having, this particular city was having a problem with abandoned homes that were the homes were closed to entry due to meth contamination. And so then they were becoming kind of a refuge for criminal activity. And so we were looking at how to solve that, and there wasn't really a good mechanism. And so there are others at my firm that are lobbyists, and I in fact became a lobbyist last year, and we worked with a lot of different organizations and the state legislature, and got a bill passed to create a mechanism for cities to come in and require the abatement of these homes so that they can be used again. What was happening is they would become contaminated, and they would just sit for decades. So so that was kind of an interesting, different area that I've really never practiced in, which is not strictly speaking a JD required field, but I think most of the lobbyists I've ran into have some kind of legal training.
Right.
And but being involved in writing the bills and going back and forth, and having the committee hearings.
So lobbyists at the state level you talk about, not
state level, not state level.
Oh, interesting. Do you like that work?
So it was interesting. It's a lot about who you know. And so, fortunately, the people that I work with have a lot of connections and are able to, get it in front of, influential state legislators. And I think it's interesting, that when you look at both the court process and the political process, you have a lot of people that are very genuinely trying to do the right thing, but have very, very different ideas of what that is.
Yes.
And so I think for the most part, we can get fairly jaded as attorneys, or we get fairly jaded with the political system. But I do think for the most part, people really are genuinely trying to do what they believe in their heart is the right thing.
Right.
Just they have different views of what that is.
Yeah. So let's just step back a little bit. So tell me how you became a lawyer. And again, it's interesting. So from Utah and also on the East Coast, you got the flavor of two very different places. How did you make that decision?
Yeah, so I don't know. I think like a lot of lawyers, it was something that I was interested in becoming a lawyer at a fairly young age, but I didn't really know exactly what the practice of law was like. I didn't have any close family members that were attorneys. My dad works for government entities, and so and does. So as a kid, there was a lot of talk about different laws, what was going on in the cities, and that was always something, dinner table discussions that came up, and so there was some interest there in learning more about kind of what was happening, what was going on. And so, and again, being a kid, I was inspired by a lot of very famous lawyers, right? You've got you look at the emphasis that our educational system puts on how a country was created, and that was largely done by lawyers. And so, with John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, individuals that were law trained and made a huge difference in just what we are as a country. And so that was very interesting to me, but again, not really knowing what it is that the day-to-day life of a lawyer looks like. And so I kind of had wanted to go on this path, and I met, as I got older, I met other individuals that were attorneys, and it seemed like, when I talked to them, it seemed like what they did was interesting. And then, so I kind of set that as a career path, and found myself in law school. And fortunately for me, I liked what I was learning, and I found it very interesting. And as I did various internships, clerkships, enjoyed the work that I was doing. I had colleagues, and I did not, got to law school and realized, whoa, this is not for me. And found different ways out of the profession, but it was something that fortunately, through maybe just luck, when I learned what the day-to-day practice was, it was something that I actually enjoyed.
Oh, good. So it resonated and stuck in you, and you're happy. And what about the kind of law that you're doing? How did you get? Because that's a real niche area.
It is. So when I was in law school, I was taking a natural resources class, and I was taking a government law class, and when I was looking for a clerkship at the same time. And I talked to my dad about it, and I said, these are the kind of things I'm interested in classes I was taking. So, well, he had done some work with the firm that I'm at now, and he said, well, you got to reach out to them and see what they've got going. They kind of practice in those areas. And so, I reached out, and it fortunately was a good fit.
Oh, good. Excellent. And you're happy. So you found your place.
I did. I am. Yeah. And I say it's I don't think everyone is that fortunate.
Yeah.
But no, I like where I'm at. I think a lot of that is there are a lot of great. I like who I work with. And so the topic, the actual field of practice is interesting. But the people that I work with, the other attorneys at my office, it's a small office, and so it's a more tight-knit group, and we interact a lot with each other, and we work on a lot of different projects together, and it requires a lot of every case is very different, and it requires a lot of times a lot of real creative thinking to try to figure out a solution for a problem with evidence that's hundreds of years old, potentially. And so that's all very, so it's very interesting, but it is, I think a lot of it too is just the people that I work with.
Got it. So just, so as you mentioned, some people fell out, some people didn't make it. So if somebody were thinking about law, what would your advice be, and what are the qualities that you think you need to make it and be happy as a lawyer?
So I think I think there's a couple things, and the first thing is figuring out what makes you happy as a person. And the practice of law can be, I think, a very lonely one for some people. It's a lot of most of what we do is not, it's not the, I don't know, courtroom drama where you're, lawyers are in court a lot less than people think.
Yeah, it's the romantic vision of a lawyer is not what the typical day is like. Yeah,
exactly. Most of the days you're in an office by yourself at a computer and you're researching or you're writing. And so at least for any kind of law practice that involves litigation, I know there are different law practices, but for the most part, being a lawyer is fairly lonely work. And if you're someone that really thrives in, having a large team dynamic and working with people every day and having a lot of interactions, certainly litigation is probably not for you. And so I think that's one. The other thing, I think, to the extent that you can, whether that if you're interested in getting into law, and if you're able to shadow a lawyer, that kind of thing, where you can kind of get a feel for what is it they do. And we have people that come through our office all the time that, they will come in and they'll work kind of, scanning documents. They may work as even just a receptionist for a while, just to, they have the intent of going to law school, but they're trying to figure out, what that really looks like. And I think that that's something that I wish I would have done. Before I went to law school, was, find out a little bit more about what the day-to-day looks like. Because I think it does, for some people, it does come as a surprise that, they get into law school, they invest in that, and then they find out, this is not for me. And then they leave and they go into another field.
I've seen that happen myself with people. After 3 months or one semester, it's like, nope, I think I'm not going to do this. So yeah, you're right. It's a big decision. It's a big investment of time and money.
It is, for sure. And I think it can be very rewarding, but like I say, I think it takes the right temperament or knowing, what it is you're getting into. And I know people that are doctors or, pharmacists and other professions that, and they've related similar stories, where, second day of medical school, somebody who's wanted to be a doctor their whole life realizes, oh, this is what this actually looks like. And I don't think it's unique to the field of law.
No.
But I think for sure the more you can find out about it, and the more that you understand and can deal with the stress of a law practice, it can be a very stressful career path. As I'm sure we have a lot of problems with substance abuse in the profession. I think to try to self-medicate and deal with that, and so finding how to deal with the stress in a healthy way is also important.
Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff. Well, listen, this has been a certainly interesting discussion. I learned a little bit about water management. I didn't realize that Utah was that was a precious commodity. I knew certainly California, because you read about the wildfires, etc. But I didn't know you had the same issues there. So that's been interesting. What just sort of final words that you want to leave with the audience about you and your practice, what you want people to know about you, and the best way to connect?
Yeah. So I don't have a huge social media presence, but no, for certainly, as you said, our firm is Smith Hartvigsen. We have a website. That's probably the my contact information's on there. That's probably the best way to connect. But no, I think my parting words or my parting thought would be, and I think this is true for most attorneys that I've talked to, and that is that if you have questions about whether or not you have a legal problem, the time to talk to an attorney is sooner rather than later. There's usually a lot more that can be done to help you out of your problem at the beginning than if you wait and you put it off. And I think it's like most things, but sometimes people are intimidated about, well, can I really afford an attorney? You know, what the cost is going to be. But even just having, you know, a consultation and finding out, okay, these are some of my options, or, you know, these are some of the risks that I have, then they can decide, you know, what it is they're comfortable with and what way they want to go forward. But if you wait, usually your options are very limited.
Got it. Okay, good advice. Thank you. All right, so everybody, Clayton Preece with the law firm of Smith Hartvigsen. Thank you very much for spending time with us. And this show is sponsored by EmotionTrac with a C, which is a legal tech platform that helps litigators prepare for mediation and trials. So thanks again, Clayton. It was fun spending time with you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.